Good afternoon, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion House, New Mexico, working on oil painting abyssal lights. Alright, today I'm going to do a simple fill on the second figure. We're going to turn her red. I've got an alizarin red and intermediate between the crimson and the bright red that I'm going to base her with, and then a light red, cadmium red, to do some highlighting, and then we'll go back with some alizarin crimson if there's time and hit some shadow sides too.
Remnants of American industrial unionism. They took on the big unions, the UAW, and rubber workers, and so on. There's one lockout, a British-owned transnational, Tate & Lyle, which made their money in the slave trade and has been progressing since. A second one was a Japanese-owned transnational, a rubber plant. There the strike had already collapsed. And the third one was an American-owned corporation, Caterpillar, and they've been holding out. They've been insisting on a very punitive contract for several years, refusing to budge. Finally, after a couple of years of striking, strike funds depleted, very little support, nobody knows about it. Last weekend, there was a vote of the workforce on whether to accept what amounts to the original contract. The workforce voted 80% to turn it down, and the union accepted it. And you can hardly criticize when the strike funds are gone. You know, they don't really have a way of keeping it going. So the strike is over with complete defeat. The New York Times business page has described it as a rout, which is pretty accurate. Over the years, there's been very little coverage of it. There's also been very little interest in it on the part of, including what's loosely called the movement or the left, the activist groups, the peace and justice groups, and so on, have paid no attention to it and given it no support. I've seen that a lot. The company has agreed to take back striking workers, but in its own sweet time and on its own terms. And it's also imposed, I'm now quoting from the Wall Street Journal, the company's imposed strict rules that sharply limit speech and conduct. Workers who are allowed back are not allowed to make references to the strike. They're not allowed to use words like scab or make critical comments on management. The gag rule, the company says, is designed to ensure a business-like environment in the workplace. Point is that workers are supposed to understand where they are, where they live, and under what conditions. Namely, they live under total tyranny, but it's private tyranny, unaccountable private tyranny, and the conditions under which they live are defined by the Stalinist commissars, who are very tough and not only design the conditions, but insist that they not talk about it. And if they do, they have no recourse because any defenses have been taken away by the capitulation and the rout. Well, they have a choice, since this is a free society. They can watch their children starve and talk about management, or if they're sufficiently servile, they can be accepted back by into the pure totalitarian institutions, which are run by Stalinist clones, commissars, who control their speech and their clothing. They're not allowed to wear T-shirts that might have something on them that suggests criticism of the company or management, and who also determine the rules under which they work and what they get for it. Wage and benefits go down. The work schedules are under the control of management, which is now allowed under the new contract to increase work as much as they like, beyond 8 hours a day with no overtime pay. There is no amnesty for those who committed the crime of going on strike. In fact, the conditions are whatever the ruling tyranny decides, down to speech codes. Now, there are laws about this which make it all illegal, but they've long been sent down the memory hole, so they're kind of just on the books. Well, the business press has explained, which is about the only press that's covering any of this stuff, has explained the reasons for the capitulation, for the rout, as the Times called it, And those reasons extend quite broadly, and they're worth understanding. They apply to most of us, as they apply to most of the world. One of the reasons is that Caterpillar has been making huge profits. Their profits were up 46% last year. That's profit growth was up 46% last year. And that's not unusual. They're high up in the Fortune 500. And the Fortune 500 last year, you know, the top 500 corporations, Fortune has an issue every year where they celebrate their achievements. And the last year's celebration is really worth reading. They were just euphoric. It was the fourth straight year of double-digit profit growth. That is, fourth straight year of double-digit profit growth. Caterpillar's 46% growth wasn't beyond the norm. You know, that's about where they were. The business press, Fortune, Business Week, and so on, they've been describing all of this as dazzling and spectacular, totally without precedent. There's never been anything like it in the history of the business world. There are some problems. You read the business press, you find there are some problems. Business Week had a headline on the problems. It said, here's the headline, it said, "The problems now, what to do with all that cash." And the reason is, when you read the article, that I'm quoting, surging profits are overflowing the coffers of corporate America, and they really don't quite know what to do with it, so they have trouble too, not just the rest of us. These are supposed to be lean and mean times. You know, everything's got to downsize, and you got to cut everything, and so on and so forth. And in fact, they are lean and mean times for about 80% of the population, whose wages and standards of life have in fact been declining steadily, and by now it's heavy decline since 1980. That's continued through the Clinton recovery. The recovery is real. In fact, there's been faster growth in the last couple of years than any time in the Reagan years. But the decline continues. That's also unprecedented. It's never happened before during the recovery. But of course, it's not for everybody. That's only like 80% of the population. And then there's a sector that's sort of stagnant. And then when you get to the top few percent, it's just been shooting through the sky. For example, CEOs, chief executive officers of corporations, their salaries have gone up about 66% since 1980, the period in which around 80% have been seen family income declining. The ratio between CEOs and industrial workers is by far the highest in the world in the United States, although England is catching up to us slowly. So the CEOs are doing fine. Investors are doing great. Capital gains have gone way up. Return on investments have gone very high since 1980, right through the roof. Speculators in financial markets are doing very well. These are people who speculate against currencies, seeking to prevent economic growth. That's their main point. They want to make sure growth stays low, which where you move your money for well-known reasons. So they're doing fine. In fact, about $1 trillion a day now is flipping up and back between international financial markets. That's a huge explosion, partly for technological reasons because of the growth of telecommunications, although it actually took off around 25 years ago when Richard Nixon dismantled the post-war economic system. The United States is the big guy on the block, so it sort of does what it wants, and it didn't like the terms at that point, so it just dismantled it, and that dismantled the regulation of currencies, and that has led to an enormous growth of speculative financial capital. Just to give you some figures, in 1970, before this, about 90% of the capital in international exchanges was related to the real economy. It was either for investment or trade or whatever, and 10% was speculation. By 1990, those figures had reversed. It was 90% speculation and 10% real economy related. And last year, according to an UNCTAD report, UN Economic Monitor, it was 95% speculative capital, 5% investment and trade. And furthermore, these percentages are not only has been there a shocking reversal, but the amounts have gone way up. This is out of a far bigger pool. The amount of capital moving around in these exchanges is huge. And it's all seeking what's called good news in the Wall Street Journal in a recent article. It's seeking good news, namely slow economic growth, low inflation, and budget balancing. That's good news, slow economic growth, meaning making sure that most people suffer. And there's reasons for that. If there's slow economic growth, currencies are stable, and you make more money if you're a speculator and so on. So you've got this enormous flow of capital, by far the most massive part of global capital, which is moving around from place to place, trying to ensure low growth and low wages. This has been understood for years. It's been understood certainly for 20 years, and that's exactly what's going on. That kind of good news is, in fact, good. And there are people who think it's good, like, take, say, Robert Lucas, who just won the Nobel Prize in economics. He was asked, naturally, as a Nobel Prize winner, to comment on the economy, and he said, we are doing great. The economy is wonderful. And that's true if we means the Fortune 500 and speculators in financial markets and top 3 or 4% of the population. We are doing great. In fact, the economic health of the country is terrific. Good news. It's almost an economic miracle, although not quite yet. That's a term we reserve for places like Mexico and Brazil and so on. And it has a meaning. An economic miracle is a place where you've got a lot of good news of this kind for foreign investors, for like a couple of billionaires, a few top % of the population. But meanwhile, during the period of the economic miracle in Mexico, and this is quite typical, wages, which were never magnificent, went down by about 50%, malnutrition went up, poverty increased, and so on. But that was economic health, because economic health is a technical term, and it has nothing to do with the health of the economy. It has to do with good news in this sense for the people who count. And Robert Lucas understands, he's a smart guy, got a Nobel Prize. So we're doing fine, the economy is great. And that's true for the people, that this is one of the main reasons why Caterpillar was able to achieve what it did and why others are doing the same thing. Well, that explosion of financial capital, in fact, a very powerful weapon against the general world population, not just the population here, but against the general world population. And that's now including the rich countries. And what we're getting is a kind of international structural adjustment applying to the rich countries as well, partly for these reasons, though there are other reasons. But the point is, if any country, say, tries to use the democratic options, say working through to whatever extent the government is democratic, if you can work through that to stimulate the economy or build infrastructure or educational programs or whatever, any place where the population tries to use those mechanisms that are available to some degree through parliamentary systems, then the countries will go bankrupt because capital will just flow elsewhere to places where there's better news, slower economic growth and more care for the people who matter, the investors and the business community and so on. Although there is an answer, of course, it's not necessary to accept the rules. The rules that it's perfectly possible to control domestic capital and to institute capital controls. In fact, it's been done. The Western countries have done it repeatedly in times that they called emergencies. And the East Asian countries, the places with real economic growth, like South Korea and Taiwan, they do it constantly. They don't have a problem of capital flight because there the governments are powerful enough to control not only labor, which is everywhere, but also to control capital, so capital flight doesn't take place. There's actually a death penalty associated with it in South Korea, but it doesn't happen, and therefore they've had substantial economic growth by extricating themselves from international markets to a certain extent, which is about the only way anyone's ever figured out to have economic growth other than the kind of good news that Robert Lucas and the Wall Street Journal are talking about. Well, that's possible anywhere, but of course it requires questioning the absolute rule of the private tyrannies, and we're taught from infancy that we're not allowed to question that. Tyranny is freedom, is what we're taught. So if all power is in the hands of unaccountable totalitarian institutions, that's pure freedom. They'll explain it to you at the Cato Institute if you don't get the point. That's one kind of, these are several of the reasons. There are others. Another way in which Caterpillar was able to achieve the rout was simply by hiring strikebreakers. And they come in two varieties. One is temporary workers. That's another huge explosion in the United States is temporary workers. Actually the biggest employer in the United States now is Manpower Incorporated, which, as they put it, sells temporary workers. Kelly's right behind them. They had huge growth in profits also last year, way up in the Fortune 500. Temporary workers are, again, an economist can explain to you if you don't know that that's good for the economy, temporary workers. You don't have to guarantee wages, you don't have to guarantee benefits. When you go to sleep at night, you don't know if you have a job tomorrow morning, which is very healthy for the economy. It increases the flexibility of labor markets and eliminates rigidities in labor markets. Again, if you've got a good education, you know what that stuff means. So that's, again, another reason why the economy is more healthy, although maybe the people are having some problems, but, kind of like Mexico, but marvelous. I should say in the case of Mexico, there's some background to things like NAFTA that aren't discussed very much, and are much more important than what was discussed. The main point of NAFTA was to try to maintain the Mexican economic miracle, to make sure that nothing happened to it. And remember what economic miracle means. It means for the overwhelming majority of the population, things are collapsing. But for the billionaires, the number of billionaires is going up about as fast as the poverty rate, which in fact was happening in Mexico. And you got to maintain that. There was a strategy session in Washington, 1991, with all kind of hotshot academics and others involved in Mexico, trying to work out, and they published a report. They decided that our U.S. relations with Mexico were very great, couldn't be improved despite plenty of murders, like a couple hundred members of the one independent political party have been murdered, but that doesn't interfere with democracy by our standards. Rapid decline in wages, increase in poverty, but relations were fine, although they did point out that there was one cloud on the horizon that we had to worry about, and that's what NAFTA was for. The cloud on the horizon was the fear that there might be what they called a democracy opening in Mexico. And if there's a democracy opening, that could be dangerous, because then people might try to get the government to follow policies that wouldn't be increasing economic health. They might be just improving the welfare of the population. So we got to make sure there isn't any democracy opening. And that's the point of NAFTA. The point is to lock them into the so-called reforms. So even if this terrible thing happens and there is a democracy opening, there isn't a lot that they can do about it, because they'll be locked into place by treaty arrangements, which are very hard to get out of, especially when you got the Matthews down sitting right to your north. So that's the real core of NAFTA, and we have similar things happening here, adapted to a slightly different society. So that's temporary workers. The other way of getting strikebreakers is to hire what are called permanent replacement workers. Now those are not scabs, they're permanent replacement workers. So you go on strike, you're out. This permanent replacement worker brought in. That's in radical violation of international labor standards. The ILO, the International Labor Organization, which very rarely criticizes a rich country.
All right, I think I've got enough time to fall off my stool to do her hair as well. Let's see.
Permitting permanent replacement
That looks okay.
workers, which is, as I say,
All right.
in gross violation of international labor standards. Of course, nobody here cares much, at least nobody important. And it makes sense, because the United States just doesn't observe international labor standards. there's a whole list of conventions about rights of child labor, slavery, all sorts of things, and most countries have signed them, but not all countries. In Europe and the Western Hemisphere, the worst record is Lithuania and El Salvador, and then comes the United States, third worst in the Western Hemisphere, and Europe in ratifying international labor standards. So the fact that the U.S. was condemned by the ILO, an unprecedented condemnation, I don't think it even made the newspapers. It's so irrelevant, about on a par with our being condemned by the World Court. Nothing to worry about. Anyhow, that's all going to be dismantled because Congress is going to cut back funding for the ILO since it commits crimes like this. They'll be gone. The U.S. has always had quite weak labor laws by international standards, and they were pretty well dismantled in the 1980s. Not taken off the books, they're still on the books, but the Reagan administration just informed employers that they wouldn't be applied, and that led to a huge increase in illegal firings and injuries and deaths on the job and so on. The only place I've really seen a good review of this is in Business Week. There was a big cover story in Business Week reporting all of this stuff about a year ago. The business press covers these things pretty well, they care. Basically what they pointed out was that it's a mistake to think that crime doesn't pay if you've got a criminal state on your side. So if the criminal state ensures that the laws won't be applied, then crime pays very well. And firing of union organizers and so on makes good sense. And you can get rid of these rigidities in the labor market, like having security, job security, and benefits, and knowing that you're going to have a job tomorrow morning, and that sort of thing. So it improves the health of the economy. Well, that's another factor that helped create the rout and is quite broad in character. Another factor, kind of all related to this, is the globalization of production. That's become a lot easier in the last 20 or 30 years for technical reasons and others, including the international flow of capital. It means it's a lot easier to have for production to be moved to places where you get the most repressed, cheapest, most beaten up people to work for you. And that's a terrific weapon against the domestic workforce. In fact, you don't even have to move the jobs. The talk about job flow is very misleading. The job flow doesn't have to change at all. It's enough to be able to threaten to move jobs, to cut back wages and benefits and so on in a globalized economy, and that happens. In the case of Caterpillar, it was very explicit. Caterpillar explained its strategy in the strike to the business press. They said they were using, a couple of years ago, they had these enormous profits, and they were using the profits to build excess capacity abroad, in places like Brazil and Asia and so on. So in case workers go on strike here, Caterpillar can fulfill its orders from foreign markets, and then you break the strike. Other corporations are doing exactly the same. It's one of the benefits of having extraordinary profits, dazzling, spectacular profits, as the business press puts it. In Boston, where I live, the biggest manufacturer around there is Gillette, and they've been using their profits to build excess capacity, even in places like Germany, where labor costs are way higher than the United States. Wages are far higher, benefits are far higher, but it's beneficial for them, even though it cuts profits, for long-term power interests, including the primary interest of class struggle. These guys are all, real Maoists, just reversed in the values, and they know they're fighting a bitter class struggle, and it makes good sense to cut down on profits to build a weapon like an ability to fill orders in European markets from a Berlin factory if Boston workers go on strike, even though it costs you more. For class war, that makes good sense, and profits make it quite possible. Meanwhile, labor moves to, production can move to cheaper areas and so on. Another factor, which is again discussed in the press on Caterpillar, is the fact that Caterpillar has been able to shift to what they call computer-controlled machines and other kinds of automation. And that's That's again, a weapon in the hands of management and against the workforce. But there's a hidden story there too. That didn't develop through market pressures. On the contrary, automation and computer-controlled machinery and so on was highly inefficient and could not be developed through the market. So it had to be developed through the state sector. We have a huge state sector of the economy here. It's called the Pentagon. And its purpose is to protect rich people from market discipline. That's one of the reasons why it stays high, even though, we lost the enemy. But Pentagon spending hasn't changed, because the primary purpose of protecting the rich from market discipline remains. If you take a look at automation, it was developed in decades through the Air Force and the Navy and so on. Well, that's protected market, protected. The public's paying for it. You don't have to worry about market forces. So containerization and computer-controlled machine tools and all that kind of stuff were developed in the state sector, and they were developed in very specific ways. There's nothing about automation that says that it should be a weapon in the hands of management. It could be exactly the opposite. The technology is quite neutral. They don't really care how it's used. You can develop automation so that it's a weapon to work and to increase managerial prerogatives, or you can develop automation to put more power into the hands of skilled machinists and get rid of management.
So that gets her base color set in roughly. Still need to do some fine tuning, but it's not bad.
Didn't get tenure in part because
And I'll increase the glow around her,
but they're very
starting out, where the yellow starts, and she'll have sort of a light about her. But that's it for the moment. So that's Adam Sturch podcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting abyssal lights. Thank you for watching, and have a good day, Earth.